Hello and welcome to another online lesson. Today we'll be talking about the Spanish-American War. I am Mr. Hoven.
And I am Mr. Valancourt. Just to set the scene for everyone out there, remember that we are talking about an era of expansion known as imperialism. And that's really where we need to begin to start off today in order to understand the actions that the United States is going to take during the Spanish-American War.
Remember, in 1825, the United States had established the Monroe Doctrine, which told all European countries to stay out of the Western Hemisphere and that the United States would be responsible for patrolling this area and maintaining order.
But there were some exceptions to this rule, and that had to do with existing colonies. Spain, by the 1890s, had two colonies left in the Americas, Cuba and Puerto Rico. But there were some problems with this.
What type of problems could occur with a larger country taking over a smaller colony and running it across the Atlantic Ocean?
Gee, this feels like a repeat. Well, Spain, controlling the smaller country of Cuba, Cuba starts to get a little agitated about this and will start to rebel against Spain. And they'll do so a couple times. In fact, in the 1880s, they are unsuccessful. And then again in 1895, they try again and are unsuccessful. But they do catch the attention of the United States of America for their guerrilla fighting tactics and because there are some newspaper writers that are very interested in what's happening in Cuba.
At this time, newspapers were the main source of dispensing information for the everyday American citizen. There are two individuals that play a key role in the use of what we know as yellow journalism. The first is Joseph Pulitzer,
who owns the newspaper The World,
and William Randolph Hearst,
who owns The Journal.
Do any of those names sound familiar? Maybe from ELA?
Hopefully they do. And these two are competing against each other over trying to get more readers than the other one. And what will happen is they will see these accounts that are coming out of Cuba about things that are going on, and they will take those stories and sensationalize them to make them more appealing to readers. But at the same time, they're distorting the stories and not sticking to the facts. There were two events in particular that really caught the interest of these New York newspaper editors with regards to Spain and Cuba. The first involves a Spanish ambassador to the United States who writes a letter that will become known as the Delome letter, named after that ambassador, in which he talks about President William McKinley. And what he says is as follows. He calls him weak and catering to the rabble, and besides, a low politician. These are not very flattering words, especially when they're published in Hearst's New York Journal in February of 1898. Americans will continue to clamor for a war with Spain, and this will start to make those cries a little bit louder. But this won't be the tipping point, will it, Mr. Hoven?
No, there's actually one event in particular which caused the U.S. to become directly involved in the crisis in Cuba between the Cubans and the Spanish. In 1898, January in particular, rioting broke out in Havana, which is the capital of Cuba. Because of this rioting and because of increased pressure, President McKinley sent the USS Maine, a battleship, into Havana Harbor.
Why does he do that?
He did it to protect United States interests and its people that were living there at the time. This seemed to go well. However, in February 1898, the 15th, a huge explosion occurred in the early morning hours.
Wait, so Spain sunk our battleship?
That's what we were led to believe. 260 officers and crewmen were killed in this explosion when the ship sank. And this was an opportunity for those New York City newspaper editors to sensationalize this event and blame the Spanish.
You mean like Hearst and Pulitzer? In fact, you're right, because on the cover of the New York Journal the very next day, headlines will read, "Destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy." In these newspapers, the Journal in particular, will offer a $50,000 reward for the person that was responsible.
The one interesting aspect of this is that the newspaper editors exaggerated this story and put the blame 100% on Spain.
That's known as sensationalism, right? When they continue to kind of take a story and make it more out of it than what they necessarily had facts for.
Often distorting the true facts and maybe making up some parts of the story to make it seem much better or more appealing to the American sentiment at that time.
So is that really what happened? Did Spain really sink the battleship?
Good question. As history's gone on, we've found more and more evidence to suggest that we really don't know who sunk this ship. There are a lot of theories or possibilities, but this is a mystery of history.
Sort of like what happened to the people at Roanoke. That's why we call it the Lost Colony. They disappeared. We have no idea what happened to them.
Exactly. It's another one of these mysteries that we won't know, but because of the sensationalism in the New York newspapers, this led to the huge push for President McKinley to do something, declare war, and get down there and help out the Cuban people.
But McKinley hopes to avoid the war, and what he will do is send a letter to Spain in which he asks for an armistice, which means an end to the fighting. And as a part of that, he also asks that Spain close its reconcentration camps and grant Cuba their independence. Spain agrees to everything except for declaring Cuba its independence.
So when Spain refuses to meet his demands, President McKinley asks Congress to declare war on it, and on April 25th, 1898, war is declared on Spain, and U.S. forces head down to Cuba. 17,000 strong were sent to Cuba. Of these 17,000 soldiers, one in particular, Theodore Roosevelt, he had resigned his position of Assistant Secretary of the Navy to fight in this conflict. He was a leader of the group known as the Rough Riders, which were individuals who were former cowhands, cowboys, and college students.
What were they most famous for, these Rough Riders?
This group of individuals is most famous for its fighting on San Juan Hill.
Could you tell me about another group involved in the Spanish-American War?
Sure can. Another group were the Buffalo Soldiers, and these were African-American individuals that came down to fight, and they made up the largest portion of the U.S. force that was sent to Cuba.
This war with Spain won't last long. In fact, it only lasts about 4 months. And this is because the U.S. has a much stronger navy than the Spanish, and because of the proximity of Cuba to the United States. There's only about 90 miles in between Florida and Cuba. And this will gain this war the reputation of being a splendid little war.
That's right. That's right. Only 400 U.S. troops actually die in battle. The 2,000 troops, additionally, that died from yellow fever and malaria, which are spread through mosquito bites. And this area of the world is known as Mosquito's Paradise.
So in December of 1898, the war officially draws to a close with a treaty. And if you're guessing, it is called the Treaty of Paris, much like others that we've heard about. But in this treaty, the United States will gain Guam, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico as territories. They will be annexed into the United States.
Now, what does it mean to be annexed?
That means that they are added on, but they are not necessarily completely controlled by the United States. They have a lot of control over themselves with U.S. influence. But what does this mean for Cuba? Cuba gets its independence, but the U.S. isn't completely removed from Cuba, is it, Mr. Hoban?
No. The U.S. creates an amendment known as the Platt Amendment, which...
But this isn't an amendment to the United States Constitution. This is just a law, if you will.
Correct. And in this amendment, the United States considers Cuba a protectorate, which means Cuba is technically independent, while the U.S. still has control.
Meaning, by control, that they are able to protect them from foreign influences, and as a part of this, the United States will create a military base at Guantanamo Bay.
The conclusion of the Spanish-American War does not end our imperialistic policy throughout the world. In fact, it grows under
President Theodore Roosevelt, who has gained esteem from the Spanish-American War, and as you know, will become president in 1901.
That's all for now. We will see you back here very soon when we cover
Theodore Roosevelt and Imperialism.